It's Sunday and it's a bonus episode of NUFC Transfer Daily as I'm going to do a Q&A. You've sent in your questions, plenty of them as well. I'm going to get through them on today's episode. So let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thanks so much for everybody who's supporting me, subscribing, liking, sharing. If you haven't already, please do join the community. It really does help. Hit like and subscribe. Today's a bonus episode of NUFC Transfer Daily. I asked you for your questions and you responded in droves on social media and on YouTube. So I've broken them into three categories from X, Blue Sky and then YouTube. I think I've got around 16 or 17 to get through. Some of them may have similar answers, so I'm just going to go through them, and then if I come across one which I've already answered, I'll put that across, hoping to get this down to around 20 minutes. But we'll see how that goes, and without further ado, we'll get into it with the very first question, and this is from X. It's from Liam, who says, is it likely Newcastle will get their main priority positions of goalkeeper, centre-back, central midfield, right wing and striker sorted this summer? And that's the plan, certainly. The four of them, maybe not central midfield being one of those priorities, even though they would like a midfield, as we've seen with Eddie Howe in the past, and we've seen with a lot of the names that they've been linked with. Versatility is quite important, and the ability to play across different positions. I think that's why João Pedro is a player that Newcastle want, because they see him playing out wide, up front, and as a number 10. For example, goalkeeper, we know that they want James Trafford. But they also like Lucas Chevalier from Lille. Whether they make that move, it'll be interesting to see, because Aston Villa have been reportedly set to do that. So we'll talk about that maybe this week. But yeah, I think goalkeeper, centre-back and right midfield and striker are the more pressing ones. Certainly, I think the very least, and this is not me saying that they'll only sign two players, but the very least, they'll sign a versatile forward who can play in both positions. I think wide and a striker and a centre-back at the very least. Those are very important positions that haven't been sorted really and upgraded. I mean, Fabian Schär and Jacob Murphy and Miguel Almiron have played in those positions over the last few years, and they were here when the takeover happened. They're the only positions that haven't really been strengthened since. So that's the plan. I think with a goalkeeper, obviously, it'll be interesting to see if they get Trafford. They have plenty of striker targets as well. That's what they're aiming to do. But hopefully in some form, those positions will be sorted by the end of the summer. Richard, is the lack of activity in any way because of the waiting for the incoming senior staff? And there are a couple of questions on around the staff and the whole situation. Obviously, Darren Eales is leaving in September. Paul Mitchell's leaving within about a week as well. And the answer to that is I don't honestly know. A message that I've certainly got from the club is that nothing is really going to be impacted by this lack of senior staff, this transition, because the targets were already lined up before Mitchell announced that he was going, and Darren Eales is obviously that there's been plans in the background. I understand the frustration. I'm kind of frustrated as well by not hearing more about the CEO progression. I think there's a little bit of context here that's needed, because if you look at this summer in isolation, I don't think they're acting slowly. I think they haven't made a breakthrough yet, but they've held talks with a couple of players. They've made inquiries as well and pushed. That's kind of usually what happens in June. Obviously, this year's slightly different because of the Club World Cup and the window opening a bit earlier. But the context obviously is not the same, because it's been 3 windows where they haven't signed somebody. I think lots of people are frustrated by that, and understandably so, and expected Newcastle to be right on top of it. Eddie Howe made a big play for being dynamic and being quick and to avoid targets going elsewhere. Dean Howson and Liam Delap have both gone. Brian Mbeumo's not going to come anymore. Other players are, linked with other clubs, like we discussed in Diamonde and Mark Gahey at the back end of last week as well. So I understand the frustration, but at the same time, if you isolate this summer, they're kind of acting within not too much different to what normally happens, and I get that is frustrating given the whole wider thing, but they are making progress, and I think quick for Eddie Howe is kind of by pre-season. I think Newcastle, fairly confident they'll get somebody in, at least one player in by pre-season starting, and a couple by the end of sort of mid to end of July. What we've seen in previous windows, they do tend to wait for their targets. Isak was late, Gordon was late, so I would imagine that Newcastle will go all the way to the end of the window to get their players, but they'll have a couple in by sort of early to mid July. I think that was always the aim, but I do understand the frustration because the context is that they haven't signed anyone for 2 years and people did expect more. Could the delay also be because top targets are at the Club World Cup? I don't think so. There are players that Newcastle do like that play at the Club World Cup. I think they were linked with Richard Rios from Palmeiras last week. But I don't think that they're aiming to go and buy players from the Club World Cup. I think necessarily, at least, unless a deal comes up, it's more that the players that they're actively, we know that they're targeting are domestic based, and those deals are very difficult to do, as I've mentioned on the show before. Next is Colin. Do you think maybe we have some bids on the table for players clubs needing to cash in before the end of June? So basically the PSR deadline. Could Trafford be one of those? I don't think Trafford will be one of those that Burnley need to sell by the end of June. In terms of, as I say, this is a PSR related question, I'm assuming from Colin. Jacob Ramsey is the one I would look at. As I said, Eddie Howe's a big fan. Villa are potentially the only club who are in real danger. I think lots of people learned from last summer where Villa and Everton were doing deals towards the end of the window. Newcastle were obviously the team that were most in danger, and I think that lots of clubs have looked at that and tried to avoid that. So you saw that January was very, very quiet across the board, and as a result of that, fewer clubs need to sell. Villa are the team that are most likely to be in trouble, and I think Jacob Ramsey is a player, as I mentioned in a video a couple of weeks ago, he's a player that I think that they're open to selling. So if anybody joins before the end of June, I would imagine it'll be someone along those lines, like a Jacob Ramsey. But I don't think that the PSR deadline thing is going to be as frantic as it was last year, because I think clubs have learned and adapted, and particularly Newcastle being the most prevalent team last season, that isn't going to be the case this year. I don't think anyone's quite in as rough a spot as Newcastle were last year. Ethan has asked, do you reckon we'll end up with another Tali type signing where we don't hear any links before the player signs? So basically, I think there's two ways you can look at the Tali signing. I discussed this about Xavi Simons the other day, being a player, a big name player who's available and sort of raises the roof. But there's another way you can look at the Tali blueprint as a player that Newcastle sign out of the blue, and I think that is kind of what Newcastle are aiming to do. It has been, the names haven't been briefed, and there's lots of people in the press pack saying, and I've sort of picked up on this too, that lots of names aren't being talked about in the media that are of interest. So I would not be surprised at all. In fact, I'd half expect it to happen that they sign somebody, roughly out of the blue. As I say, Tali emerged a couple of days before, once the deal was almost agreed. Then the medical was sort of, everyone picked up on that. Isak was very similar. With Isak, they talked about him. Real Sociedad earlier in the summer failed and then went back after Wilson's injury, and that was very, very quickly done, and that was a very strong decision. That is what Newcastle will aim to do if the opportunity arises. As I say, opportunity arises is a key thing there. It depends on the value of the player. It depends on the position of the player, what they bring. But I think that is what they're aiming to do, is try and sign players as quickly and as cheaply as possible off the radar, and that's why they're undoubtedly interested in João Pedro and Anthony Elanga, but they're not the only target. So I would actually half expect that to happen. Alex has asked, are the club actually making offers for players, or has Eales and Mitchell's departures completely paralysed decision making? If so, that's a huge issue. Again, I don't think that this is the case. They're speaking to Brighton about João Pedro. They've talked a little bit about Anthony Elanga. They've had conversations with Burnley about James Trafford. The other thing I want to mention is that a lot of people don't quite have the right understanding of how a deal works. Basically, lots of people think that the bid comes first. The bid is often the last thing that happens. They talk to the player's agent to get an idea roughly of whether the player would be interested and what sort of terms they'd be after. Then they go and talk to the club, and the bid is actually the last thing that concretes the interest, and all the discussion happens before the bid is sort of agreed in principle and then officially made. Kind of, that's roughly how it works. Not all the time, but I wouldn't get too hung up on the fact that bids aren't happening. And as I said earlier, I'm not convinced that it's necessarily too much to do with Eales and Mitchell, although I do concede that the fact that those things are rumbling on in the background at this particular time in the summer is a little bit chaotic. And now we move on to Blue Sky. APB 1987, simple one really, mate. What the hell's happening? Why is it taking so long? And as I say, it depends on your context, and I hope this doesn't come across like I'm defending the club, because I actually agree with a lot of the criticism in terms of like they should have been more ready for this. Lots of the things that are emerging in the recent days are that things will ramp up towards the end of June and at the start of July. I think that's not really a surprise because of the PSR deadline. Maybe that is a factor. Again, the context of the summer is that they've held talks with clubs, that they're in discussions about players, that they've identified their targets, that they are moving on those deals. That tends to be how things happen in June. This year is slightly different, but and again, it's framed completely differently this summer because it's off the back of 2 years without major first team signing. But as I tweeted the other day, Tali hadn't happened quite yet by this point in the summer. Pope and Sven Botman neither. If Newcastle are still at this position at sort of mid-July, I think that's when you start to get a bit concerned. But I'm fairly confident, and the club are fairly confident that they'll have somebody in by pre-season. I do caveat this by saying, I was similarly confident, and I only have to go off what we hear from different people. Until that first signing comes in, those sort of questions aren't going to die down. I fully get that. So Juan has asked, trying not to sound like a stalker, but do you know if Eddie Howe is working or on holiday currently? Don't have his diary, but the only thing I can say on the insight of this is that Eddie Howe spoke to the press, I think last year or the year before, and basically said that when he was in America around this time, driving across America with his family, he had his phone on him all the time and he was in constant contact. So I would imagine he is probably on holiday, probably not officially working, but everybody knows what Eddie Howe's like. He tends to keep an eye on things even when not officially working. And I think that's probably the case. I would imagine he's very, very much in the loop on things at the moment. Magpie Kev says, is there anyone that went under the radar that you rate but we've not previously been linked with? As I said the other day, I think Newcastle maybe look at Tapsoba. I think that's a really interesting one. And there's a question on a potential player that I think is another interesting one, which I'll leave till I answer that one as well. But Tapsoba is one that they've really liked and they have made moves for last time. As I said on Friday's video, that's one that's maybe slightly more possible now than it was. I would imagine that that's something that Newcastle may look at. And the other one I have a sneaking suspicion about is, and going back to that sort of Tonali question, is Magnus Akliouche. I know Newcastle have scouted him for a while. I know he has been linked, so maybe that doesn't technically answer the question, but he's another one I have a sneaking suspicion Newcastle may make a move for. RJ McCready on Blue Sky says, does the makeup of the new transfer committee suggest any change in thinking? Eddie, Andy Howe and Nixon, as you'd imagine, would be all on the same page, but saw Jack Ross is in there, maybe has some different ideas on targets. Newcastle aren't at the target stage now. They've already been at the target stage in sort of March, April, May, and actually Paul Mitchell is kind of in on those meetings as well. This was all before he had announced his departure, so I'm not sure Jack Ross has too much to do with it. Andy Howe's obviously in there, Nixon's obviously in there, and Eddie Howe together. But Mitchell's departure doesn't actually impact the targets of players because it was already sorted before. And as I say, that list is a lot longer than you or I are aware of. The next one is Ruddy Marvelous, or Ruddy Marvelous on Blue Sky says, while not splashy names, could you see the club going in for Harwood Bellis, Kyle Walker or Tyler Dibbling from Southampton? So this is the other one that I thought about to the point of the question about potential players who Newcastle haven't been linked with. Harwood Bellis is a player that they've liked for a long time. He's 23 years old, capped by England, I think, once. Very, very talented defender. Went to Southampton when he was linked with Newcastle for £20 million last summer. That's one I wouldn't be surprised on because they do like him and he is the right age. Would he be the ideal signing from a lot of perspective as Newcastle fans? Maybe he isn't on the level of Gahey or Diamonde, but seeing what Newcastle do with Tino Livramento, I would imagine that they would absolutely look at that deal. Kyle Walker-Peters is slightly different. He's on a free. That probably would depend on Kieran Trippier's future, which is still kind of up in the air. But I think that I'm less sure on that one personally. And Tyler Dibbling perhaps is the one that I think would most likely fit the bill at the right price. Newcastle have explored this extensively. I've spoken about him quite a lot. There's a lot of clubs after him. The price would have to come down. Obviously, Southampton's 100 million valuation that was floated about a few weeks ago or months ago is far from the reality, but if it's sort of 35-40 million, I'm sure Newcastle would consider that. He's definitely a player that they like, and sort of most of these players in the sort of Tino Livramento realm, I would imagine, that of somebody who can come in and it might take a year or two, but would step up. And we're seeing now with Livermento's performances at the back end of last season at left back, and now obviously in the Euros, the under-21 Euros with England, how well he's doing. And I think that is kind of a blueprint, one of the blueprints that Newcastle look for in a transfer, and that does fit certainly Tyler Dibbling, but potentially Howard Bellis as well. Why are off-field appointments taking so long, and what is our squad recruitment model? Again, there's a couple of questions on the squad recruitment model, which I'll touch on as we go. The sort of thing about Newcastle where things do seem to happen quite slowly, and there isn't really an answer for that. And I think it does need to be, in my opinion, clarified as to why this is happening. There are plenty of names in the frame for CEO that they've been discussing, and also sporting director or technical director. I think that'll be a slightly different role. But yeah, I do agree. I agree with the frustration here. I understand it, and for me, there needs to really be a little bit more clarity. But in terms of an official answer, I'm afraid I'm not in a position to really give one. Apologies. On YouTube, we've got Johnny who's asked, are Newcastle looking to change tactics, and what players could facilitate that? Maybe not directly looking to change tactics, but as I mentioned earlier, most of the players that Newcastle are interested in are versatile players who can do different things, and it is quite telling that none of the players so far on the list have been a direct left-footed inverted winger, which is what Eddie Howe has always been on record saying that he wanted. Obviously Jacob Murphy did that role so well last year, maybe it's changed his thinking, who knows, but I think Newcastle maybe not looking to change formation directly. I think 4-3-3 is very much their home from home, but maybe looking to sort of add a number 10, unlock the door in different ways, have more versatility, do different things. We saw already how go 3 at the back and 4-4-2 at times at the back end of last season, not officially just in-game, just to try and do things. I think maybe that's more what his thought process is. He wants a squad more capable of being fluid and flexible with formations and tactics. Next one is Dexter, who says, is Newcastle's recruitment strategy fit for purpose? This one's down to opinions. Obviously, Paul Mitchell was sort of heavily criticised or vindicated, depending on what your thought process was, by his comments last year, where he effectively said this. And I think in two ways you can really look at it. Yeah, they've signed Tali, they've signed Isak, they've signed Botman, and I think that attitude is still very much in place as well. So I think in that sense, it's absolutely fit for purpose because they've got evidence of signing really, really good players. And then on the flip side, also getting players like Hall and Livramento in who've got a huge future, and then helping them reach that. And I would put Gordon in that bracket too. But answering specifically on bidding for domestic players at high prices, and these deals are taking so long, that's where I do sort of understand the question. So again, it depends on your thought process, but Newcastle is still in the position where they can go and try and sign those Tonali, Isak players, and obviously his names have been mentioned today, players who are very similar to Tino Livramento and Lewis Hall as well. So the jury's kind of out because they've obviously made tough decisions over the last couple of years, and I think more questions are being asked because of how slow off the back of that Newcastle have been this summer so far. But again, I would say give it a few weeks and see. By sort of midpoint of July, we'll have more of an answer on that, I think. The next one is, what about sales? Do we have to sell to buy? Is there a clear plan? Newcastle have never been particularly good with sales. I think that's kind of been obvious. There lots of talk of Callum Wilson signing a new contract and that impacting the striker search. I honestly think that would be a mistake. Joe Willock is available. There's some Sean Longstaff at the right price. There is context around Longstaff being the homegrown rule in the Champions League squad. Newcastle don't have a ton of players who fit that. I think they need 4 players who are trained by the club over the age of 21. And he is not, and those players don't grow on trees in terms of the squad, so that might impact Longstaff's thing. But they do need to react and sell more players, because this is a thing that I think that they should have probably looked at selling Wilson off the back of finishing 4th a couple of years ago. Almiron 2, St Maximin was the player that they sold again, even though they didn't really want to do that. And then they were forced into selling Anderson and Minter in a very panic situation last time. And the more that those players don't get sold, the more likely it is that a bigger name has to go to sort of balance the books, which is a real disaster, I think. Anthony Gordon's probably one to watch, I would imagine. Again, I don't have any prior understanding of this, but I think if Liverpool are to sign a player for Newcastle, it won't be Isak, it might be Gordon, because they're very much interested. That nearly happened last year, and Newcastle are crucially more open to that, as evidenced by the fact that they actually talked about that last summer. So I would imagine that that's possible, and as Willock and Longstaff as well. But yeah, I do agree with the sort of sentiment that Newcastle needs to be better sellers. But do they have to sell to buy? No, I believe they don't. From Dexter as well. The club promised evolution, not revolution. Was stagnation part of the plan? I think that's slightly tongue-in-cheek, I'd imagine. There's a little bit of context to be said here, is that the PSR, teeth of PSR, if you like, the fact that it actually became a serious issue, happened in between a lot of things. So when Newcastle came in, obviously they tried to toe the line on PSR. They then took risks with Gordon and Isak, and then not getting into Europe really did harm them, because it meant that they couldn't spend a great deal on top of that, because they were already against the line because of those two deals. But also, as I say, between that, Everton and Forest got points deductions. Nobody really expected that at the time, I don't think. So suddenly now PSR is, and you've reflected this in the whole league as well, this has been seen across the league in the last couple of years, that has had a massive impact, and clubs are now more cautious than ever. That's maybe adding into all of this sort of slower way of working, because as I say, it's generally league wide. I do agree with the idea of stagnation. They got into the Champions League off the strength of Isak and Tali and a couple of other players performing at the right time, and they got themselves over the line with a cup, which is an amazing achievement. But the squad is still stale and still, very much at risk of decline. It needs refreshing. And there's a video that I did last year where I said that Newcastle were in decline just before they went on that incredible run, and you could imagine that maybe that looks like I'm been proved wrong, but I really don't believe it has. I really believe that the squad needs a refresh, and needs more players to help the likes of Tonali and Isak, because as happened at the end of the season, Isak was playing when he was half fit. So stagnation wasn't part of the plan, but I think, as I say, they took risks, and then missing out on Europe has had a massive impact. Having to sell two fresh players who, if you add Minter and Anderson to last year's squad, it looks a lot more healthy, it looks a lot better. But Newcastle was scarce of options and an ability to spend off the back of some risks that they took, which you can't really say they backfired, because they've got back into the Champions League and won a trophy, but held them back maybe slightly over the last couple of years. Final question is, what's your view of the executives? Club seems stagnant. Again, accountability, responsibility aren't clear. And I think this is where we'll talk about the recruitment as well, because that was a question from earlier. As I say, I do think that there needs to be more decisions being made. That's something that I've said, and I think that I believe. And, is it impacting the recruitment structure? No. As I said, I think really the recruitment is based around players who are the 21 to 23 years old, and with an ability to improve, the certainty that Eddie Howe likes. I think that is where, to answer the previous question about the impact and the structure, that's where Eddie Howe's impact is that he wants, it's not necessarily Premier League based players, because he's brought in Tonali, he's brought in Isak, but he wants to be more. He wants players to hit the ground running. That's why Newcastle see domestic targets as maybe the best bet. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not targeting players. As I said, the list is a lot longer of targets than we know it is. I hope those questions are answered suitably. Thanks so much for joining me on this video. Like, share, and subscribe, and I'll be back tomorrow for another week of regular episodes of NUFC Transfer Daily. Catch you then.